Hello, welcome to the supplemental anatomy of the respiratory system video made later from all of the other ones that I have already posted. So in this video, I'm just going to go over the anatomy of the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. And then the original videos from last year are posted and they start with the alveolar anatomy, kind of what's called the respiratory zone structure. So I'm just going to go through all of the conducting zone, and then the videos from last year will pick up with the respiratory zone, the actually surfaces of where gas exchange takes place. All right, so the respiratory system, we're going to divide it into what's called the upper and lower respiratory system. There's really not a clear distinction between what is the dividing line, because for me, a lot of times I talk about the larynx as part of the upper respiratory system and the trachea as the beginning of the lower. That's not really super duper important, just that there is a division of the structures that are kind of up here versus the structures that are kind of down here. Kind of makes sense, right? So we can see the upper structures are mainly going to be centered around your nasal and oral cavities and your pharynx, which is basically the fancy word for your throat. And then the lower respiratory structures are basically your trachea, bronchi, and lungs, and all the tubes that are going into the lungs. So we're going to start looking at the details of the upper respiratory system. All right, so before we get into the details of the structures, we can talk about the mucosa. So if you remember back in 231, we were learning all the different types of membranes, right? We had cutaneous membranes, synovial membranes, mucous membranes, and serous membranes. So we've seen serous a couple times already, or at least once with our pericardial membrane, the visceral and parietal components of that. We're going to see that again, these serous membranes in the pleural cavities with the pleural, visceral, and parietal pleura. But remember, mucosa are the membranes that line open, cavities that are open to the outside environment. So that's going to be your respiratory tract, your digestive tract, your urinary tract, your reproductive tracts. So in the respiratory mucosa, it's probably the most diverse of the epithelial components that you're going to find associated with this membrane. So in your nasal cavity and in your trachea, we have that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Again, refreshing from by 231 histology section, but also we have stratified squamous epithelium in the oropharynx before it splits into the trachea and the esophagus. In the bronchial tubes, we have some simple cuboidal, and then all the way down to the alveoli, we transition again to simple squamous. So know that the respiratory mucosa really follows that structure and function relationship, where the structure of the tissue is going to match the function that has to take place. This particular slide is showing you that kind of more unique type of tissue, the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, found lining. Primarily, we see it associated with the trachea, but there's a few of that up here in the upper tract as well, or the nasal cavity. So remember, we have these pseudostratified cells. They are ciliated. They kind of have this beading-like motion that carries this mucus along the top of it. There's goblet cells that secrete this mucus embedded throughout that mucosa. And basically, in the trachea, what they do is they kind of elevate that mucus with all the debris and stuff that's trapped in it up to your pharynx. And so when you swallow, you swallow that debris and mucus into your digestive system, which can be kind of destroys it. And usually there might be some bacteria in there. And that's one of the ways that we can prevent infection from getting deeper down into our more delicate lung tissues. All right, let's take a look. A lot of these structures might sound familiar to you because they are bony landmarks. So you might have some, oh yeah, I remember that from 231 boneless stuff. So we're going to start taking a look at the pathway as we breathe in through the mouth, as we breathe into the nose. I don't know, what was I thinking? So here we have our external nares. Nares just as our nostrils. It's just the opening. You know, when you pick your nose, that's what you stick your finger into, your external nares. And then the space just up inside that opening is called the vestibule. I don't think I'm going to circle everything. So we'll do nostrils, the vestibule, And then what that's going to do, that's going to open up into your nasal cavity, which is dominated by your conch. So if you remember, part of our bony landmarks was our superior, middle, and inferior nasal conch. Superior and middle were part of the ethmoid bone, and the inferior was its own set of bones. Now, when we're looking at this lower picture, it really looks like the nasal cavity is this big, wide open space. But they give us this drawing over here. Oh, I should include that. To really see, it's not a big, wide open space. These conch really take up a lot of the room in there. And so when air moves through, when we're breathing it up into this nasal cavity, it bumps into, sometimes they're called turbinates. It helps to make the air turbulent as it goes through, because what we're wanting to do is trap any debris and gunk into the mucosa that's surrounding these bony protrusions. And this mucosa is very vascular. So the warm blood helps to warm the air. It helps to humidify the air. So we are, in essence, conditioning the air before we breathe it down deeper into our more delicate respiratory passageways. So your superior, middle, and inferior nasal conch, lined by this mucosa, help to warm the air, humidify the air, and trap debris. Now, a new term that's going along with that are the meatus. So your nasal meatus, superior, middle, and inferior, those are just the grooves or the gaps that you're going to find underneath each protrusion of the conch. Okay. All right, we have our frontal sinus. We saw that back in our bone chapter. Here's just the nasal cavity. All right, and now we have where we had external nares are your nostril openings. We also have what are called internal nares or cona. It's just basically the space at the very back of your nasal cavity, and that leads into the nasopharynx. So the pharynx, we have three parts to the pharynx: naso, oro, and laryngopharynx. It's a continuous tube, and so the name just changes as we move from place to place. So the uppermost part of the pharynx is called the nasopharynx. It's right at the back of the nasal cavity. The next is the oropharynx, which is just posterior to the oral cavity and the tongue. And the laryngopharynx is where the actual pharynx splits between continuing into the digestive tract with the esophagus and moving into the respiratory tract with the trachea, and is where your larynx is found. So those are your three parts of the larynx: naso, oro, and laryngo. Within the nasopharynx, some of the features that you will be able to see are the pharyngeal tonsil, kind of way back at the back of that throat. We have the entrance to the auditory tube. So if we remember, the auditory tube was that connection between the middle ear and your pharynx. And we also are going to identify the soft palate. So we remember the hard palate. Oops, I just crossed it off instead of underlining it. The hard palate is made up of the palatine process of the maxilla and the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. And that only goes back so far. And then we still have a continuation of the separation between the oral cavity and nasal cavity. And this is what we call the soft palate. And then it dangles down. It's not showing it, but the very distal end of this here is going to be the uvula. Okay, we'll see that, I think, more in the digestive system. So the uvula, this flappy part of the soft palate, when you swallow, it folds up and it closes off your nasal cavity. So when you swallow, food and drink doesn't go up into your nasal cavity, which is good. Okay, so now we are in the oropharynx, and this is where we can see the palatine tonsil and the lingual tonsil on the back side of the tongue. So we've seen those back in our lymphatic system. Okay. And so now we are in the laryngopharynx, which brings on all of the structure of the larynx, which we'll talk more about next, because I have a slide just of the whole part of the larynx. And then this is where we have our epiglottis, which is one of the parts of the larynx, but I'll talk about it now because this is the flap. Just like the uvula, this flap closes down over the trachea, so when you swallow food, the bolus of food will go down your esophagus and not your trachea. If it does go down your trachea, you choke, basically, and if the food bit is big enough, it could cut off your air supply, and then that's when you're actually choking, and you could die of suffocation. If it's smaller than the opening of your trachea, it could go down and get lodged somewhere in your respiratory tract, and that's also an emergency which needs to be taken care of right away. They can send scopes and little tweezers and stuff to go down and remove whatever foreign object gets down into the lung or the trachea or the bronchi. All right, so those are the major structures of the upper respiratory system. So now we can take a closer look at the larynx. So the larynx is your voice box, right? So if you want to know where it is, you can just talk, put your hand on your throat and just say words, and you can feel it vibrate. And you can kind of say, okay, so that's it. And another way to locate where it's at is to put your hand over your throat and swallow. And you'll feel your your thyroid cartilage elevate. Okay, this is the big thyroid cartilage right here. It's this big anterior surface, and in men it has the laryngeal prominence, which is what we call the Adam's apple, which is a little bit larger in males. So yeah, the biggest part of your larynx is the thyroid cartilage, this big anterior shield-shaped piece of hyaline cartilage. This is all hyaline cartilage, with a few exceptions. It is not complete all the way around. It does not create a circle. So if you'll notice, you can see that here's the edges. It's kind of open on the back side. The next largest cartilage is called the cricoid cartilage, and that is complete around. It's a complete circle. It's a little bit narrower on the front and wider on the back side. So we can see how it kind of goes like this. So here's the anterior, here's the posterior of the cricoid cartilage. So that kind of is the base of the larynx, and the thyroid cartilage sits on top of that. Okay? And on the back side, there's a few smaller cartilages. So the arytenoid is kind of this triangle shaped, and then we have the corniculate, means horn-like, corniculate, like little horn sitting on top of the arytenoid cartilage. And then the last one is the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is made up of elastic cartilage. All these other ones I've listed are hyaline. Elastic because it's got to be flexible. It's the one that kind of bends down, like we just saw in that last picture, folds over your opening, your glottis really, so it kind of folds in this direction, folds down, covers the entrance into the trachea, so then food can kind of slide right past it and going down into your esophagus. Okay. So as far as memorizing this, we will see a model of our larynx in the lab. You just need to know those major cartilages. So your thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, arytenoid, corniculate, and epiglottis are the cartilages. I'm not going to be asking you the muscles or the ligaments of this. But you also know that it is suspended by the hyoid bone. So you might remember that also from 231. The hyoid bone helps to elevate your larynx when you swallow. All right. The next part is the function of the larynx. Not only is it helping to protect our tube of the trachea to allow us to not get food and drink down into our respiratory tract, but it also gives us the ability to make sound. We have voice, we have language. We are using the air that's coming out past the structures in the larynx to vibrate these membranes, and that gives us our voice. So there's two sets of membranes or folds that we can see in the larynx. We have what are called the vocal folds. We can see them closed here. We can see them open here. The vocal folds are also called the true vocal cords. So these are what actually vibrate when you have a voice, when you're making sound. We have the other fold are called vestibular folds. So here's the vestibular folds. They kind of fill up the rest of the space of this kind of doorway down into the trachea. So these are sometimes called the false vocal cords because they are not vibratory. The word, they don't vibrate to make sound. So they do not participate in sound production. They are just more of the protective doorway so stuff doesn't go past in the glottis. The glottis is the actual opening. So remember epiglottis, epi means above. So here's your epiglottis, which would fold over the glottis when you are swallowing food or drink. So there's some really cool videos, if not posted already in the helpful links, I will post one of a laryngoscope, which is or stroboscope sometimes, where they shine a strobe light down somebody's throat as they are making these vocal sounds. And you can actually see, because strobe light makes really fast things look slow, you can see the vibration of those vocal cords, the true vocal cords or the vocal folds. It's actually very fascinating. So make sure you check that out as well. All right, so that's how we talk, is as we exhale air, we vibrate those vocal folds, and the different pitches or the different sounds that you get from your voice is how tight or loose those vocal cords are. All right, so now that we are done with the trachea, we are done with the larynx, we can move on to the trachea. So this is kind of what we just got done covering. So now we're going to move into the trachea, which is this long tube. It is surrounded by hyaline cartilage rings. These are called tracheal rings, tracheal cartilage, made up of hyaline cartilage. They are not continuous. There is a smooth muscle, trachealis muscle, on the back side. So they're more like horseshoe-shaped cartilage pieces. And then you can see the esophagus sits just posterior to that. And one of the reasons why you don't have a complete ring of cartilage in your trachea is because when you swallow a bolus of food, you want that ability to kind of enlarge and bulge into the trachea, so you don't protrude forward, so you don't continue like push all of those cartilage rings forward. All right, so nothing much more than the trachea other than that's your windpipe. It's just this tube that's held open by the tracheal rings. It is lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, our respiratory mucosa we talked about already. So then when we get to the base of the trachea, we have this kind of V-shaped cartilage here. It's called the carina. Okay, and that is the split of our single trachea into our first of our bronchial tubes. And these are called your primary bronchi. So you have a left and right primary bronchi. It is the first branch off of the trachea, and they will each lead into their own lung. So right primary bronchi leads into the right lung, left primary bronchi leads into the left lung. Right. So then if we continue down our bronchi, so here would be the carina, this, here's one of our primary bronchi, here's our other primary bronchi. These are going to then break into what's called our secondary bronchi or lobar bronchi, because they branch into the lobes. And it looks like my head's kind of blocking off. This is just going to say lower down here. Right there. So on the right lung, so this is the right side, we have 3 lobar bronchi, right? 1, 2, 3. So each one of those lobar bronchi, sometimes called secondary bronchi, primary, secondary, tertiary, or main, lobar, or segmental, we'll see those, are going to branch into each lobe. We have 3 lobes in our right lung, and we have 2 lobes, right? So here's our lobar bronchi here and our lobar bronchi here. So then we have 2 lobar bronchi or 2 secondary bronchi on the left side. And then each lobar bronchi branches into the segmental or tertiary bronchi. So that's kind of the colored pieces here. So these are going to be each one of these little, as they're yellow, the purple, the pink. Those are going to be the segmental bronchi. The blue, the red, the green, the yellow, the green, the blue, the orange. Each one of those are going to be leading into their own segments. And these are still all bronchi. They're held open by cartilage rings or plates. As we get kind of further away, we don't have rings quite so much. So that's the main bronchi. So we have primary bronchi, secondary, tertiary, or if you can say main, lobar, or segmental, that's the same pattern. Then they continue to branch into smaller bronchi and then into bronchioles, and eventually we'll lose all of the cartilage rings, and then we transition to smooth muscle. Okay. Here's just a larger view of those lobes, taking a look at the external lung structure. So again, the right lung has 3 lobes, a superior, middle, and inferior. The left lung only has superior and inferior lobes. The left lung also has what's called the cardiac notch, which is kind of just a place for the heart to fit, which makes sense. Both lungs have an oblique fissure. Oblique kind of is these angle cuts. Separators, and then we have the horizontal fissure between the superior and middle lobe of the right lung. Okay. On the back side, we have this region. We haven't really seen this word too much. You may have seen it in the lymph node structure. It's called a hilum or hilum. Sometimes you see it with an S, hilus or hilus. It's usually just kind of an indentation where blood vessels and tubes and stuff go into and out of something. So this particular hilum has your pulmonary arteries, your pulmonary veins, and your bronchi branching into, kind of penetrating into the lung tissue. Okay, and then lastly, just a quick look at your pleural cavity and membranes. So remember we were taking a look at serous membranes. So serous membranes are found in sealed body cavities. So just like we had the pericardial, visceral, and parietal, we have the visceral and parietal pleura, which are found in the pleural cavities. So your visceral pleura is found on the surface of the lung. The parietal pleura is found on the wall of your pleural cavity. And then we have, the pleural cavity, and then we have the space in here. This is going to be very important when we get to some of the physiology because there is a negative pressure relationship here. There's negative pressure between the visceral and parietal pleura. And what that does is when your thoracic cavity gets bigger and your diaphragm goes down, it's going to pull on that parietal pleura, which because of that negative pressure will pull on the visceral pleura, which is attached to the alveoli, which are going to allow them to get bigger, which will allow us to inhale. So that's going to be all part of the physiology. All right, so that wraps up the anatomy piece. The next video that I made last year, which will say, this is the first video. Now it's technically the second video, but it's going to pick up with after that branching from the small bronchioles down to the terminal bronchiole, and then it's going to pick up at the respiratory bronchiole. So this is where I'm going to leave off, and that is where you can pick up. All right, thanks. I'll see you next time. Bye.